You are looking at a jar of wild yeast that can bake your bread for a year without store-bought yeast. San Francisco bakeries have kept this culture alive for over a century, but you can capture it in your kitchen with just two ingredients. In 2019, scientists found a secret in that foam that the bread industry doesn't want you to hear. It begins with a single ratio, 100 to 1. Stay with me. A sourdough starter is not a recipe. It is a living ecosystem that, fed nothing more than flour and water, will outlive you. Yet most home bakers have been told it is too difficult, too unpredictable. The truth is the opposite. And once you understand how to capture what is already floating in your kitchen, you will never hand money to a yeast company again. This is how the simplest biology on Earth replaces a grocery store aisle forever. To understand how we forgot this, you have to go back to a time when every kitchen had a bubbling crock on the counter, and nobody called it artisanal anything. For 6,000 years, bread rose on wild yeast. The Egyptians did it. The Romans did it. Every farmhouse in colonial America kept a starter fed from the same flour that went into the loaf. The process was not a hobby. It was daily survival, and it worked so reliably that nobody wrote down instructions because a child could do it. Then, in 1868, a chemistry that had never failed was replaced by a single invention, and within 2 generations, grandmothers across the Western world stopped teaching their daughters how to keep the culture alive. The man who changed everything was Charles Fleischmann. With his brother Maximilian, he built the first compressed yeast factory in Cincinnati, Ohio. The product was brilliant, uniform, predictable, fast. A loaf that once took all night could be on the table in 2 hours. Fleischmann's yeast won awards at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876. The company handed out free samples to immigrants arriving at Ellis Island. They published cookbooks, baking manuals, school pamphlets. They told women that wild yeast was inconsistent, unsanitary, a gamble. In 1940, Fleischmann's magazine advertisements showed a housewife smiling over a perfect loaf with the line, "No failures with Fleischmann's." The subtext was poison. Natural leavening meant failure, and failure meant you were a bad wife. The campaign worked so completely that by 1960, fewer than 5% of American households still maintained a starter. The knowledge had not disappeared because it was false. It disappeared because someone spent millions to make you believe it was. And then science quietly proved those advertisements were a lie. In 2018, the Global Sourdough Project at North Carolina State University sequenced microbial samples from 560 starters in 17 countries. They found something the bread industry had no interest in broadcasting. The flour itself carries everything you need. Wild yeast and lactic-acid bacteria arrive not on the wind but inside the wheat. This means the starter you build on your countertop is not hunting for microbes. It is activating a blueprint that was already dormant in the grain. Professor Rob Dunn, who led the study, said the diversity was staggering. Starters from San Francisco carried different yeast than starters from New England, but every one of them produced stable, repeatable fermentation. The age of the starter did not matter. A 2-month-old culture, baked as predictably as a 100-year-old heirloom. The only variable was how often you fed it. And that is where the 1:100 ratio becomes the most important number in this entire documentary. Because the yeast you imagine doing all the work is almost irrelevant. Lactic acid bacteria outnumber yeast cells by roughly 100 to 1 in a mature starter. That ratio is not an accident. It is a symbiosis so tightly choreographed that the bacteria eliminate competitors and feed the yeast exactly what it needs. The yeast produces carbon dioxide, The bacteria produce organic acids that defend the colony, break down gluten, and turn an ordinary flour water paste into a living preservative. The bread does not mold because the starter built an invisible fortress inside every crumb. Commercial bakers' yeast cannot do any of this. It is a monoculture stripped of its bacterial partners, bred for speed alone. And that speed comes at a cost. You are still paying every time your loaf goes stale in 3 days, or a label lists 10 ingredients you cannot pronounce. But before I show you exactly how to build a starter that will live forever, you need to know what happened to the last American baker who tried to tell the truth in 1941. Because the day his best customer turned against him is the reason the bread aisle still hides a billion-dollar secret. And that secret begins with a war nobody connects to your breakfast table. The war was World War II, and the man was a San Francisco baker whose starter had fed the city since the gold rush. In 1941, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps faced a problem. It had to ship bread to millions of soldiers across 2 oceans. The bread had to survive weeks in a crate, resist mold without refrigeration, and be produced in staggering quantities with unskilled labor. Traditional wild yeast bread took 12 hours to rise. It demanded a baker who could read the dough, adjust for humidity, and feed a living culture that punished neglect. The army could not wait, so it turned to the same company that had spent 70 years convincing housewives that wild yeast was failure. Fleischmann's offered exactly what the military needed: a shelf-stable cake of monoculture yeast that proofed dough in 90 minutes flat, uniform loaves, identical every time, no skill required. The army signed massive contracts. Industrial bakeries retooled their lines to the new standard, and the small shops that had risen their dough with mothers, passed down for generations, lost their biggest customer overnight. One of those shops sat on the corner of Columbus and Pacific in North Beach. The baker kept a starter he claimed originated in the French Basque Country in 1849. He had supplied longshoremen, firemen, and gold rush miners. But when the army contracts vanished, his walk-in customers followed. They had tasted the new enriched white bread that stayed soft for a week. They had been told it was modern, scientific, fortified with vitamins. The old sourdough, with its tang and its crust, and its stubborn refusal to be rushed, looked like a relic. He shuttered his ovens in 1943. His last batch of starter was dumped into the bay. Nobody documented it. Nobody called it a loss. But that one closure repeated in 1,000 towns, and the consequence was not just taste. It was buried in the bodies of everyone who ate the new bread for the next 8 decades. Because when you strip wild yeast of its bacterial partners, you lose more than sour flavor. You lose the army of lactobacilli that break down gluten into simpler proteins your gut can handle. You lose the acidification that neutralizes phytic acid and frees up minerals like magnesium, zinc, and iron. You lose the fermentation that degrades FODMAPs, the fermentable sugars that cause bloating and pain in 1 in 7 Americans. The bread industry never volunteered that information. But in 2019, researchers at the University of Bologna took bread made with commercial yeast and bread made with mature sourdough starter and fed both to subjects with diagnosed gluten sensitivity. The sourdough group reported almost no symptoms. The blood markers for intestinal inflammation dropped by more than 60%. The lead researcher, Dr. Giovanni Dinelli, wrote that the lactic acid bacteria had hydrolyzed the gluten peptides before the bread ever entered a human mouth. The starter had done the digestion in the bowl. That study was published in a top-tier food chemistry journal. It was shared in 0 advertisements. No baking conglomerate funded a follow-up. And the reason is the same reason that 2,000 agricultural stations vanished from the Midwest in 1937. A living culture takes time, and time cannot be patented, packaged, or sold at a markup. So the industry redefined time as inconvenience and convenience as progress, and they buried a number that makes the whole illusion collapse. 100 to 1. That is the ratio of lactic acid bacteria to wild yeast in a properly maintained starter. When you own that ratio, you own a digestive engine that commercial bread cannot replicate at any price. And here's where the story breaks in your favor. The same biology that the Army abandoned in 1941 can be rebuilt on your countertop in 7 days with ingredients you already own. No envelope of powdered factory yeast, no 90-minute rise, no pillowy loaf that molds in 3 days, just flour, water, and a sequence so simple the first person who discovered it probably stumbled on it by accident. You have been told this is hard because someone wanted it to look hard, but the Amish of Lancaster County never stopped keeping their starter. The San Francisco bakeries that survived never stopped feeding theirs. And now I am going to show you exactly how to build a wild yeast colony that will outlast the next 3 wars, starting with nothing more than a clean jar and the flour sitting in your pantry right this minute. Take that jar, add 1 cup of whole wheat flour and 1 cup of water. Stir it until no dry powder remains. Seal it loosely and leave it on your counter. That is day 0. You have just begun farming a microbial civilization that will feed you for the rest of your life. Within 24 hours, nothing visible happens. But inside that paste, enzymes in the flour are converting starch into sugar faster than you can see. The first bacteria arrive not from the air, but from the bran, dormant and waiting. Within 48 hours, the mixture will bubble. You will smell something slightly sour, a little like overripe fruit. That smell is lactic acid, the weapon, not a flaw. By day 3, the starter will double in volume and collapse, and you will see webs of gluten stretched across the glass. You are witnessing a succession. First, colonizers, like leuconostoc, produce acid that eliminates competing pathogens. Then, the true acid-tolerant lactobacillus species take over. When pH drops below 4, wild yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which thrives in acidic environments no commercial yeast can tolerate, begins to dominate. This self-sterilizing cycle is so precise that a healthy starter can kill introduced Salmonella or E. coli within hours. The same bacterial shield that protects the jar will later protect your gut. By day 7, the culture stabilizes. You have a mature starter with that 100 to 1 ratio. And once you have it, you will never start over, because the next number you need is 1 to 1 to 1. When you feed, you keep 1 portion of old starter, add 1 portion of flour, 1 portion of water. The discard is not waste. It is pancake batter, cracker dough, pizza crust. Every gram of this ecosystem can become food. And here is the part. The commercial baking industry spent a century hiding from you. A mature sourdough loaf contains no isolated starches, no dough conditioners, no calcium propionate mold inhibitor. It will sit on your counter for 5 days and simply dry out. It will not grow penicillin. The acids that lactobacillus secretes are identical to the preservatives food manufacturers chemically synthesize and print on labels as E280 and E282. But because your starter created them naturally, they legally do not exist on any ingredient list. You can finally eat bread with 1 ingredient: flour, water, salt, and thyme. Yet if you walk down a supermarket aisle right now, and grab a loaf labeled sourdough. There is roughly an 80% chance what you are holding has never met a living starter. The term sourdough is not federally regulated in the United States. A manufacturer can spray acetic acid into commercial yeast dough, bake it in 40 minutes, and call it sourdough. The Cheesecake Factory, Subway, and Panera have all faced lawsuits for selling sourdough breads that contained zero wild yeast. The real thing takes patience. The fake thing takes shortcuts and charges you the same price. In 2021, the American Bakery Products Association lobbied against a proposed definition that would have required a living culture. The letter to the FDA argued the regulation would burden small bakeries and confuse consumers. The letter was signed by directors from Pepperidge Farm, Bimbo Bakeries, and Flowers Foods, the same conglomerates that own the enriched white bread market. They are not confused. They know what the word sourdough means to a health-conscious shopper, and they know that if every American realized a jar and a spoon can outperform a $37 billion industrial baking machine, they would stop buying the loaf that costs $4.99 and turn moldy in 3 days. What comes next is the exact sequence to turn your 7-day-old starter into a crackling, oven-sprung loaf cheaper than the fuel it takes to drive to the store. And the first bite will change how you remember bread ever tasted. The night before you bake, take your starter out of the fridge. Feed it equal parts flour and water. Within 4 hours, it will dome and bubble and smell sharply of ripe apples. That is your levain. It has reached peak activity. Pour 1 cup into a large bowl. Add 3 cups of flour, 1½ cups of warm water, and a tablespoon of salt. Mix with your hands until no dry pockets remain. Cover it. Wait 30 minutes. Then pull and fold the dough 4 times every half hour for 2 hours. You will feel the gluten tighten, the mass transform from sticky paste into smooth, elastic silk. Let it rise on the counter. Not for 90 minutes, for 4 to 12 hours. The longer the fermentation, the more the bacteria hydrolyze the gluten and release minerals your body can finally absorb. By the time you shape the loaf, the acids have already preserved it for days. Preheat a Dutch oven to 500 degrees. Drop the dough onto parchment. Score the top with a razor and seal it in the pot. Steam will trap and gelatinize the crust, giving you the blistered, crackling shell that commercial bakeries replicate with steam injection ovens that cost more than your car. Bake 30 minutes, with the lid on, 15 with it off. When the internal temperature hits 208 degrees, pull it. Let it rest 1 hour. If you slice it hot, you will destroy the crumb. Wait. The bread you pull from that pot will weigh less than 3 pounds and cost you about 75 cents of flour and salt. The same weight of artisan sourdough at a farmer's market sells for $8. In a year, baking once a week, you save over $370, and you will never have thrown away a single plastic yeast packet. The loaf will last 5 days on the counter without molding. The acids you cultured yourself are doing the work. No calcium propionated, no sodium benzoate, no enzyme blend that the FDA allows bakeries to list simply as enzymes. Just flour, water, salt, and thyme. That ingredient list is older than agriculture. It is older than writing. And in 2023, a team of archaeologists in Turkey unearthed a piece of bread from a stone oven at Çatalhöyük, a settlement that flourished 8,600 years ago. The crumb was charred but intact. Under an electron microscope, the starch granules showed unmistakable signs of fermentation. The bread had been leavened with a wild starter. A Neolithic baker fed a jar and made a loaf, and enough of it survived 8 millennia to prove exactly what any grandmother in Lancaster County could have told you. This knowledge does not belong to any corporation, any factory, or any generation that tried to bury it. It belongs to whoever decides to feed it. If you could bake your first loaf tomorrow, what would be the one thing you want it to taste like? Drop it in the comments. I read every answer, and hit subscribe, because in the next video, I am going to show you what that discarded starter can become. The food it makes will change your kitchen more than the bread itself. The jar you filled 7 days ago holds the same fermentation that fueled Çatalhöyük, fed the French Basque country, and kept San Francisco alive when the army tried to make bread a commodity. No lawyer can write the living out of that paste. 8,000 years of bakers stand behind the foam on your counter, and the corporations that tried to replace them spent a century winning shelf space, while losing the only thing that matters. You own the ratio now, 100 to 1. The bacteria that do the heavy lifting will not ask for a paycheck, and the starter will not die unless you let it. The bread aisle has not changed since this video started. You have. Hit subscribe. I will show you exactly how to turn tomorrow's discard into crackers that taste better than the loaf itself.